Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Ask GN now that we are back from Computex. We had a lot of questions to dig through the Discord chat for Patreon backers. If you're not one of those, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to join the Discord chat. A lot of fun with everyone on there, and they've submitted some great questions, but we also have some from YouTube from the previous Ask GN video. Before that, this content is brought to you by custom backplate makers at v1tech.com. V1Tech builds GPU backplates to order with their online customization tool, making it easy to theme upcoming PC builds. Backplates cost $25 and up and are installed via magnet and can be seen in some shots of the cards we're reviewing lately. Use code GamersNexus5 for $5 off your order or click the link below. Before getting started, as always, you can leave your questions below if you have them for next episode. And right now, the one I want to start off with is pretty timely and topical. This is from I'm A Jedi Brah on Discord, who asked, am I allowed to ask a question about this image? And he sent me an image that we can probably put on the screen. And said, given the 28-lane CPU and 24 lanes on the chipset, it seems to give you more lanes than X99's 40-lane CPU. I'm curious to see if the grief Intel got was premature. Now, regarding the grief part of this is in reference to a lot of the talk online the past week or so about PCIe lane count on Intel's upcoming Skylake X and Kaby Lake X CPUs, mostly Skylake X really, and how those CPUs, the $600 one especially, have a lower lane count than you might have expected. So the question being, well, if you add the lane count on those CPUs to the lane count available through the chipset, why is there an outcry? Because that's still a lot of lanes. So first thing to go through here is a primer on PCH versus CPU lanes. This is a question I've answered a lot in Ask GNs indirectly over the past probably 6 months or so, but it's worth doing again in a more dedicated format. PCH and CPU lanes are not the same, at least on Intel platforms, or especially on Intel platforms. The way Intel does it is they have a certain amount of lanes on the CPU, maybe it's 16 for some of them. Those lanes are pretty much reserved for graphics. So those will go from the CPU straight to the PCIe device, whatever that may be, normally a video card in the first slot. Maybe you have 2 video cards and you can run 2x8 configurations, or if you're running AMD and you can crossfire, then you could run 3, but you'd be stepping down to a by 4 in one of the slots, and you'd probably want some kind of PEX or PLX chip on there. But the way their chipset works is the PCH has a certain amount of HSIO lanes, or high-speed I/O lanes. High-speed I/O lanes on the chipset are somewhat assignable by the motherboard manufacturer. So let's say you have 30 HSIO lanes, as with the current Z-series chipsets. If you have 30 HSIO lanes, some of those will be reserved, but most of them you can assign out as the manufacturer, not as the user, and send to devices like gigabit Ethernet. Maybe you use some for 10 gigabit Ethernet. If you have the capability on a workstation board, you might send them to other PCIe devices like M.2 SSDs that might be on an NVMe protocol or something like that. But you can send out these lanes to different devices on the board. U.2 would be another example. And those devices, high-speed I/O, are normally going to use something like by 4. So because of this, the PCH can only assign its lanes in chunks of 4. So by that I mean, if you wanted to pull lanes off the PCH and use them for a device in a full-length 16 PCIe slot, what you would actually be doing is pulling 4 lanes off the PCH, or peeling off the lanes, we say, and applying those to the slot. So the slot might be wired for 16, but it will only receive 4 from the PCH. Now, realistically, what will happen is, as long as the CPU has lanes available, it'll assign all those lanes down to the PCIe slots for all your graphics devices. Pretty intelligent about that. But if you exhaust those lanes and run out of them, and you have to pull something off PCH, it's in a by 4 config. That's not compatible with SLI. SLI demands by 8 at a minimum. It could work with Crossfire, but your quality of lane goes down off the PCH. The argument, I think, or the concern, or whatever it may be from all the discussion online, is that generally speaking, you want as many lanes as possible out of your total lane count to come off the CPU. It's a bit higher value because those lanes are going to be assignable to graphics devices and they're on the CPU. Whenever you're eliminating steps from the process and having to go physically elsewhere on the board, it's always a good thing. It's a bit faster. So I think that's what a lot of it is, because the value of the lane on the CPU is higher, and for multi-GPU, you kind of need it. But also I think what happened, or what has happened with some of the grief, as you put it, that Intel got was probably to do with perception of how these lanes are created, where it looks like, and I'm just kind of interpreting what I've seen online here, not making a comment, but I think what people see is it looks to them like Intel basically throws a switch and turns off or on a certain amount of lanes for a product to potentially artificially create a product in a different price category that would otherwise be identical to a higher tier product with more lanes that costs more. And there may be some truth to that. I'm not 100% sure how Intel manages their lanes. I don't know the validation steps that go into having more lanes. Maybe there is actually some cost involved there. There probably is. But is it the cost that we're seeing in these new products? I can't answer that. However, I think that's where a lot of the discussion online has come from, is that that understanding of the situation and the fact that the CPU lanes are higher value than the PCH lanes for things outside of HSIO, like graphics cards. So hopefully that primer on how PCH and CPU lanes are assigned and used helps out with understanding why you would want more CPU lanes, even though the total CPU plus PCH lane count is higher. But if there's more questions on this, leave them below. That is, by all means, not the most comprehensive discussion you could give on this topic, but given that this is an Ask GN and we've got other things to go through, I think that's not bad to get you started. Next question is from Jesse Schalken, who posted on YouTube and said, I'm choosing a 1080 Ti for water cooling. Do the better VRMs on AIB partner cards actually make a difference for overclocking, or are they just for show? Some say the Founders Edition has ample power capacities, others say it doesn't. So specifically speaking to the Founders Edition 1080 Ti, we have a PCB analysis, which includes a VRM analysis done by BuildZoid on our channel. And as BuildZoid says in that video, the 1080 Ti Founders Edition card actually has a pretty good VRM. It is one of the better products that Intel has designed, or Intel, talking about Intel all the time, NVIDIA has designed in the past year or so with regard to reference boards. Actually longer than that probably if you look back farther. But it's a good board. The Founders Edition card is actually not bad. The problem is the cooler. The cooler is kind of bad, but if you're gonna buy it and water cool it, then the board itself is pretty good already. That said, it does have lower power capability. It will physically push less power through the circuits than some of the higher end cards like you might get with a Strix, or if you go really extreme, like a Kingpin or a Lightning card. But it depends on what you're doing, how useful those extra phases and those higher quality VRMs might be. So with something like a Strix, you're buying more than just the different VRM, the custom PCB. You're buying a better cooler than the Founders Edition has. Some of that value is lost when you're water cooling anyway. And with a Kingpin or a Lightning card, there is definitely value to be had in those boards, because if you're doing XOC stuff, LN2 or otherwise, you eliminate a lot of the footwork where you would have to do hard mods to the card in order to get it to carry the same capacity as an out-of-box Kingpin card. Something like that is eliminating a lot of the work on the FE cards. But for just normal water cooling and for maybe some very basic overclocking, by which I mean you go through EVGA Precision or MSI Afterburner or one of those tools, and you set some kind of offset to the core and call it a day, Founders Edition is really not bad. It is fine for that application and is basically exactly what it's meant for with regard to water cooling. There are better options, but to answer your question, I don't think that you will really get a significant gain in your clock out of those alternatives. That said, if you're running at stock, the aftermarket boards generally do have a higher stock clock rate than the FE card, almost always. And in those cases, you would see a difference in FPS. It can be anywhere from 6%. Well, it's probably going to be about 6%. But if you're moving from FE Air to liquid-cooled other card or air-cooled other card like a Strix, it's 6 to 11%. So hopefully that helps with that one. Basically, FE is fine. if you're doing something, some fairly basic overclock with it and water cooling. Next question is from Rarson on Discord. Rarson says, in the delidding video, Der Bauer mentioned repasting. This is something I hadn't really given much thought to. I know stock thermal paste on OEM computers is usually pretty poor, especially after 5 or more years, but I've never really noticed any thermal issues with my own builds, although I don't really check once it's set up and configured. Is this something that an enthusiast would want to check on a long-term or regular basis, or perhaps preventative maintenance item? Nobody really covers long-term effects with respect to thermal paste, and I suspect that's probably because there's not much hard data out there on the subject. That's definitely true. Anytime you're looking at something that takes years to accumulate, it's hard to really do research on it. So yeah, Der Bauer mentioned repasting. He was, I can't recall off the top of my head if we were talking about repasting after you've delidded the CPU or repasting the outside of the IHS. But either way, let's just assume that we're talking a more normal application where you've got the CPU installed, it's not been delidded, and you just have some thermal paste on top of it and then your CPU cooler. I have seen the effects of thermal paste aging to some extent with poorer products. Laptops come to mind. We did some thermal paste changes on one of the laptops I was working on recently. I think we even have a video of it, and saw a pretty massive change in thermal performance. So that also involved blowing out the fans. But that paste on laptops, a lot of them, it kind of turns into like a crystallized, really hard, useless compound that all it does is interrupt contact between the two metal plates that want to make contact, or the die in the metal plate. So yes, definitely there are long-term effects where thermal compound can age. Not all of it ages. The Dow Corning stuff that Intel uses inside the IHS actually does really well with thermal cycling, which is how you measure the life of thermal paste, by the way. It's in thermal cycling. So that does really well. The stuff I've seen in a lot of laptops is garbage and should be redone every couple of years, especially because laptops are not airtight and dust gets in there. If dust can get into where your thermal paste is in your desktop or your laptop, it will rapidly age the compound. You start getting little particles in there that interrupt the contact between the surfaces, and overall the aging is a lot faster and the compound loses performance. So the best thing to do is test your performance using something that you're going to remember how to do in a couple years, and repeat that test maybe yearly or something like that, and just see how it's doing as preventative maintenance. It should be pretty obvious if your performance really gets bad, because you're going to start dropping clocks or hearing the fans go crazy to try and keep up with the CPU temperature. So if the fan speed starts ramping a lot over time and it's louder than it used to be, it might be a thermal compound contact issue, or a pump fail, or something, or a liquid permeation in the loop, or something like that. But yes, it's actually a real thing. You should repaste every now and then, but it does tend to be a couple of years. It's not like something you're gonna have to do more than once a year, or even once a year. We're talking a couple of years for most pastes. The next question is from Notwist on Discord, who said, quick question, if there is a temperature limit for CLCs, which is ill-advised, well, I suppose to rephrase this, is there a temperature limit for CLCs which is ill-advised to surpass? Is a hybrid GPU that is 70 degrees under load okay, or will the liquid at that temperature give me headaches down the road? Going back to the focus on silent computing, what's the max recommended temperature you would run a CLC at? The max recommended temperature, well, the maximum temperature by spec for Asetek coolers, which is what you would find on a traditional hybrid mod, is 60 Celsius for the liquid. Not for the silicon, but for the liquid. Liquid temp is a whole lot lower than the silicon temperature, but the 60 Celsius number is what Asetek specifies for when there start to be problems. So those problems would include things like permeation almost exclusively, where at 60 Celsius liquid temperature, you start experiencing permeation into the rubber tubes, at which point you've got less liquid in the loop, so the pump has to work harder, you're going to hear it whine a lot more, and your temperature will be worse over time because you're losing liquid out of the loop. So 60C is the number that you're looking for Asetek products, and other products like Coolit or CoolIT, although I don't have their number, are not going to be dissimilar from that. As for the max temperature for a hybrid GPU, we've had pretty good luck running those EVGA hybrid kits, specifically including their stock fan, at 40% fan speeds, and still staying below most air-cooled cards, like less than 65C for sure, but off the top of my head, I think most of the time we're in the 50 to 60 Celsius range at a 40% fan speed with the pump at max, so you should probably step that down 10% also. So you'll be fine there, and it'll be really quiet, quieter than everything else in the system unless you've got a fully passive, like very quiet or passive power supply and very quiet or passive CPU coolers. 40% fan speed is perfectly safe. Liquid temperature is well within control. It's under 35C in all of our testing, but if your ambient's really high, it would still be under 40C. So that should hopefully get you started there. The spec though, 60C is the number. Last question, Chaiwat Kositkhun says, I believe this is from YouTube, says, with new processors going to more than 140 watt TDP, will air coolers continue to suffice while remaining of sane proportions? Dissipation is roughly fin area, which is pretty much the occupied volume of the fin stack. So if we take a Noctua N15 or C1 and scale by 140 over 95 or 190 over 95 in the case of threadripper, that arrives at, quote, fucking huge, hanging off your motherboard, surely, which is one of the most accurate specifications you could give for that system, yes. No hate on AIOs, but my only worry about them is reliability, especially if one has a few systems to maintain. Do you think we'll be seeing a whole new generation of larger or more efficient air coolers, or will those processors be limited to liquid only? There will definitely, air coolers will still be fine. They can handle 140 watts if they're designed properly and have a good fan and have enough surface area and things like that. Threadripper is a different story. I'm not really sure what Threadripper will be equipped with. I'm thinking that it'll ship with a stock liquid cooler, kind of like what we saw with the FX 9000 series. That's my guess. So I'm thinking stock liquid for those. I'm not really sure what the air cooler market looks like once you start getting into the higher TDPs past 150, which is what Threadripper may end up in, with at least with overclocks and things like that. So I'm not 100% sure the answer to that part of the question. For 140 watts, there will still be coolers. It should be possible to buy some that aren't huge. I mean, like the Be Quiet Dark, what is it? The Dark Rock 3 Pro, Dark Rock Pro 3. That cooler is gigantic. It has one of the worst mounting mechanisms I've worked with, but it's huge, like you're saying. And I'm not convinced that it's within the Intel spec for some of the sockets that are like LGA 11.5X sockets, though it would be fine for 2011 sockets. So there's definitely a point where you can start entering into CPU coolers that should not be used on things with the smaller sockets like 11.5X. But keep in mind that the 2000 series sockets from Intel, 2066 now, and the TR4 socket will have a stronger mechanism so that you shouldn't be as at risk of warping the board, which is really what you're worried about when you have those higher weights and densities in a small area. With the TR4 socket, I don't have the spec for it, but if you look at the thing in its current state, it takes 3 Torx screws, I think, might be Allen keys, but 3 Torx screws to undo a giant piece of metal with a huge, really thick back plate, like 1 to 3 millimeters thick on that back plate. So it should be able to support a pretty large cooler, but I do think those will be liquid. For Intel, the answer is yes, you will still be able to get air coolers. The thing you start running into is they might become a little less efficient if you were to run them at a fixed noise. Like if you normalize for noise between air and liquid, you start running into problems with some of the air coolers on the market if you're trying to stick at something like 40 dBA. But I agree with you that air coolers tend to be a little bit more preferred for an application where you don't want to have that one extra potential point of failure in a liquid solution, like a pump or whatever it may be, or just aging, because those CLCs only really live usefully for about 5 years before you should replace them anyway. So I agree with you there, but I don't have a great answer for you. I think we saw some of the coolers coming out of Computex are trying to solve for this problem. Some of them are going a bit crazy with copper. That seems to be one of the things this year, which won't really help steady state temperatures a ton if you're looking at two identical coolers other than copper and aluminum, but it will help with controlling the fan curve and with ramp up and ramp down times. So that we'll be testing all that stuff. I have a lot of thermal testing plans for both Threadripper and Skylake X. Not sure about KB Lake X, but we'll be testing those. So stay tuned for all that, because we should have that information out pretty shortly after launch for all the products, so you can make your decisions before building the system. Well, that's all for this one. As always, you can leave questions below for next time. Patreon.com/GamersNexus to help us out directly, or to join the Discord chat where some of these questions come through. It's really easy to interact there, and I hang out there most of the day, so easy to get to the questions. Thanks for watching as always. Subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.